have an interesting story for you. George Remus was born in Germany. His parents came here when he was about 5 years old. And at first they settled in Milwaukee, and then they moved to Chicago. His mother's family had settled in Chicago. He was a good student in the Chicago public schools, but he left school about the age of 14 when his father suffered a work injury. And he was the oldest child, and so he went to work at a young age in his uncle's pharmacy. And so he went to night school to run a pharmacy himself, and to become a pharmacist. And he passed the test, and eventually ran his uncle's pharmacy and bought another pharmacy. And he even did some medical studies and provided things like almost like medical care to people in the neighborhood and eye care and whatnot. And eventually he married one of his patients, Lillian Krause, and this is his first wife. And he was a restless guy, and he was bored with being a pharmacist. So he went to night school and studied to become a lawyer. And he became a lawyer, and actually a very successful lawyer, criminal lawyer. He was known for having a very flamboyant style in the courtroom. And he defended several people on murder charges. In fact, he was perhaps one of the first people to not successfully try to get his client acquitted on the grounds of temporary insanity, although he did save him from the electric chair. My favorite story, though, was he had a client who was accused of poisoning his wife. And the trial was not going well. And so it was time for final arguments. And so he stood up in the courtroom and walked over to the stand where there was the exhibit A was the bottle of poison, the alleged bottle of poison. And he began his final defense by saying, there's been a lot of talk of poison in this trial, but it's all a bunch of piffle. And he picked up the bottle of poison and downed it. And then he went on speaking and speaking and speaking. Of course, everybody's got their eyes glued on him at this point, see if he's going to keel over or not. And he spoke for about 45 minutes and then sat down. Well, the jury returned a not guilty verdict. People asked him, well, how did you do that? His clients and that did. And he said, I'm a pharmacist. I took the antidote first. So he was quite successful as a lawyer. And he was also involved in local Chicago politics. And yes, that's an infamous Chicago voting box there of votes. And he was making about $50,000 a year. It was quite a successful guy. He was also a little bit of a health nut. He did not drink alcohol. He was a complete teetotaler. He was an avid swimmer, and he's actually the third guy from the left here. And he did all kinds of weird swimming competitions, especially long-distance swimming. He did wintertime swimming in Lake Michigan, did distance swims in the Mississippi River, and was a bit of a health nut. And his nickname was the Napoleon of the Chicago bar. Well, like Napoleon, he also had a troubled marriage. And in 1915, his wife sued him for divorce for both physical and mental abuse. And then she later withdrew that petition. But then a couple years after that, he took up with this woman. Her name was Imogene Holmes. And he first met her when she was working at a delicatessen. And then she got hired at his law firm as a secretary, and they began an affair. She had a daughter from a previous marriage. She'd been left by her first husband. Her maiden name had been, last name had been Brown. Their affair became public when Remus came to her apartment once, and there was a plumber there, and Remus thought the plumber was there for something other than plumbing, and he bodily threw him out of the apartment, and the plumber sued him for assault. And so that kind of made the affair public. So at that point, Remus and his first wife did divorce. Now, while that was going on, Prohibition came to America. A lot of people don't know this, but different states went dry at different times. And the state of Illinois actually went dry about a year before national prohibition. And Remus was quite amazed that These criminals were coming in, these bootleggers, and peeling off $100 bills and that, paying their fines very simply. And he was not too impressed by how bright they were. And when Prohibition went national, it was supported by something called the Volstead Act that was to enforce Prohibition. The Prohibition Amendment itself is worded really, really vaguely. So Remus made a study of this, and he decided that there were certain holes in the Volstead Act. And even though Remus himself was a teetotaler, he didn't think you could legislate away America's appetite for alcohol or thirst for alcohol. And so he decided that he could do something, he could make a lot bigger business of this than the small-time bootleggers he was seeing. Now, he decided Chicago was maybe not the best place to set up for business. There was already a lot of organized crime in Chicago. And these were two of the big bosses at the time. The guy on the left was Joe Colosimo. The guy on the right was Johnny Torrio. And around this time, Torrio had Colosimo bumped off. Later on, Torrio is going to bring a guy to Chicago to help him named Al Capone. And so Chicago looked like the organized crime people had pretty much muscled in on Prohibition. So he did a study of where was most of the whiskey in America. And he figured out that about 80% of the bonded distilleries in America were within a 300-mile radius of the city of Cincinnati. Cincinnati didn't have any big organized crime gangs at this point. They did have a lot of German, Irish, and Jewish immigrants who weren't all that keen on Prohibition. And so he decided he would set up shop in Cincinnati. And at this point, he had about $100,000 of his own money. And he also partnered up with two other people who already had experience running alcohol into some of the dry states before national prohibition. So to explain the operation he had, you may find this hard to believe, but even back in 1920, Congress was cheap. Despite making alcohol illegal as a beverage, they did not compensate the distillers. So we're talking about scores of businesses around the country, a lot of them within 300 miles of Cincinnati, who basically have been told, well, your product's now illegal. You can only sell alcohol for medicinal purposes or for industrial purposes, or a small amount as sacramental wine, and that's about it. But they didn't compensate distillers in any way. So Remus knew you had all these distilleries that had thousands and thousands, well, probably millions of gallons of unsold alcohol just sitting there in warehouses that had now, you couldn't legally get at, unless you had a withdrawal certificate. And the withdrawal certificates were to legally take booze out of a distillery or a warehouse for a purpose that was legal, like selling it to a company that used it for medicinal purposes. You could prescribe alcohol, straight alcohol, for medicinal purposes. Doctors could do that. And this is a prescription page where a doctor could do that. They actually prescribe you a six-pack to settle your stomach if they wanted to. And some doctors would. But also, a lot of alcohol is used in medicine. Different chemicals, different medicines are suspended in alcohol. So Remus got the bright idea is, I will come to Cincinnati and I will set up some wholesale drug companies. And I'll go out and buy up distilleries or buy up warehouses full of alcohol, and I could legally sell the alcohol to myself. And maybe some shipments might get lost. Or maybe we'll take the withdrawal certificates and we'll change the number from 10 barrels to 1,000 barrels. Or maybe we could pay off some government officials who would be willing to sell us withdrawal certificates. And maybe they'll want to return a couple bucks on every case or whatnot. And basically, he kind of made a shell game. And if you looked at the directories for Cincinnati in the early 1920s, you'll see all these wholesale drug companies in downtown Cincinnati that kind of pop up and disappear and pop up and disappear, or the names change. So that's what he did. And it was quite an ingenious plan, and it worked very, very well. He bought up distillery after distillery. Sometimes he would just buy up a warehouse full of stock. And so he moved to Cincinnati. He married his girlfriend, Imogene, and this photograph here is kind of interesting one. This was taken right after they got married in Covington, Kentucky. And obviously that's Imogene to his right. The girl right in front of him, her name was Ruth. That was Imogene's daughter by her first husband. And Remus adopted her and treated her quite well. She got paid for her tuition to go to the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, bought her a big fancy piano. Another person, the guy right behind Imogene, is her brother, Harry Brown. And he'll come up later on in the story as well. Well, to say the least, Remus's plan worked great. And he didn't have a home at first, so he set up in the Sinton Hotel in downtown Cincinnati. And his business got so big so fast that it attracted federal investigators. And there was a guy named Frank Mellon who many years later wrote this story for the Saturday Evening Post. He was a young guy who was brought in as a wiretapper for the federal government. And he set up in the hotel room next door to Remus's. When he was out, Remus, he drilled a hole to set up his bug, and he also tapped the phone. And he had two stenographers who, round the clock, were recording the conversations that Remus had. And all kinds of local government, law enforcement officials and people and businessmen came in and out of that room. Remus paying all kinds of different bribes. I think he said he paid bribes to 44 different people, averaging about $1,000 each, giving it out like a Santa Claus giving out a candy cane at Christmas time. And so Mellon brought the evidence, he brought the typed evidence to the guy who was supposed to be the Prohibition Commissioner for the Southwest Ohio at the time. And he left the room while the guy read over the transcripts and came back in. He said, man, this is about October 1920. He said, man, this stuff is dynamite. There's an election in a few weeks. You know what? Just forget about it. Just go back home. Just forget this ever happened. I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to touch it. And so Remus was safe, at least for the time. So the operation got bigger and bigger, and he hired more and more people. At one time, he had about 3,000 people on his payroll. Eventually, he realized that he was going to become a target, not so much for the government, whom he had pretty much paid off, but for other bootleggers. And this is a photograph taken of Cincinnati in the early 20s. This is actually looking from one of the towers of Suspension Bridge, looking north into downtown Cincinnati. But there was an incident on Suspension Bridge that happened one night that made Remus kind of change his thinking. He was riding with a convoy of trucks, carrying his alcohol, when they got hijacked on the Suspension Bridge. And there was a cop at either end of the bridge that both just kind of stood there watching. So a rival came by, and they basically hijacked the trucks. And Remus tried to protect them with his fists and got a nasty cut on his head. And at that point, he realized, well, I'm going to have to protect my shipments. This business is getting to the point. He didn't want to have to do that, but he eventually did. Now, the guy he hired was this guy here. The guy to the right here is Ernest Buck Brady, who worked in a rail yard. Now, this photograph is taken much later. This is 1946, but it's in the early 20s. But he basically hired Brady to be the muscle to protect his shipments of alcohol. Brady armed his men, too, with shotguns and machine guns and whatnot. I should mention that the guy who wiretapped Remus, to give you some idea of how big his business had already gotten, one of the phone messages he had gotten is that a shipment of 18 boxcars full of his alcohol were coming in that night from Cincinnati. So like I said, his business got very big very fast. And he befriended a guy named George Connors, who was a former, used to work for the IRS in Cincinnati and was now a real estate agent. And Connors kind of recommended this piece of property And this is just a little farm in the hills west of Cincinnati, near the suburb of Cheviot. And it's kind of a secluded place not far off of Queen City Avenue. And to the left, there's a little kind of like a shack that was sort of used as a guardhouse. To the left was a barn, and to the right was a house. And this became the main depot for Remus's alcohol. The barn had a large basement underneath it, so quite a lot of alcohol could be stored there at one time. And supposedly, on the roadway, they dropped a little guiding pathway of tar to show where you turned off the main road down the lane. And trucks and large cars, they would take the labels off the alcohol and wrap them in newspaper. Stuff the trucks full of them, cars and trunks full of alcohol. And they'd be coming and going all hours of the day and night to this depot. One time, a rival group did try to raid the depot, but they were, with firearms, they were scared off. We don't know if anybody was hurt or whatnot, but after that little battle, Remus's men like to call it the Death Valley Farm, was the name for it. The next photograph is kind of overlooking the farm. The house up on the hill there belonged to a family named Hubbard, and that's going to later figure on in our story. Okay, this is a colorized photo from the 1920s of downtown Cincinnati, showing the incline that went up the western hills to the Price Hill area of Cincinnati. And so Remus bought a property not too far from the top of the incline on what was then around the corner of Hermosa and 8th Avenue. And this mansion had belonged to a guy who used to own a brewery called the Lackman. He bought the Lackman mansion, and he and Imogene fixed it up, put a lot of fancy artwork in it. And remember, Remus was a nut about swimming. So he also built a big indoor pool. And that was kind of the highlight of the mansion. And it had inlaid mosaics in the pool, and Remus supposedly swam every day. Of course, you see it here, all kind of plants and flowers around it. And this is one of the parties. Remus was famous for the parties that he held. There was a big party to celebrate the completion of the pool, and there was another party held on New Year's Eve. He wanted to attract the high society of Cincinnati. The high society never showed up, but some reporters did, to kind of see what it was like, and of course family members and other people among the people who worked for him, his lieutenants, so to speak. Now, this particular one, we can identify some people. That's Remus at the far right at the table sitting down. Imogene is standing to his right. Kind of behind him and to the left is his adopted daughter, Ruth. The woman right next to Remus's left is his sister, Frances, and the older woman seated to the right of where Imogene is standing is Remus's mother, who is visiting from Chicago. The rest of the family still lived in Chicago. And then back here at this end, second from the left, is Harry Brown, the brother of Imogene. And I'm not sure, because he was a big guy, but probably the guy at the far left, or maybe the guy in the back, was his right-hand man, George Connors. Not sure. He's probably in the picture somewhere. Now, his most famous party, though, was one that took place on New Year's Eve of 1922 to 1923, which ironically was after Remus had already been found guilty of bootlegging. So I'll backtrack to the trial a little bit. But at this party, when they came in to eat dinner at the New Year's Eve party, when they lifted the napkin from their plate, every man there had a diamond bracelet that he could then give to his lady. And then when the party ended, every woman at the party got a new Pontiac that was driven up. And this was kind of a way of showing off that no matter about this conviction, I'm still extremely rich. Now, Remus knew that as his business got bigger, he needed protection at a higher level. And so his lawyer, a guy named Zoline was his last name, who, by the way, was quite high reputation lawyer. He'd argued some cases in front of the Supreme Court. He got him in touch with this guy. This guy's name is Jess Smith. And Jess was from Washington Courthouse, Ohio. And he was working in he kind of was had an unofficial role in the Harding administration. And Jess Smith was the best friend. In fact, they shared an apartment with this guy, Harry Daugherty. Harry Daugherty was the Attorney General of the United States. He was really a small-time Ohio politician, actually not a very successful politician, but then he started to become a campaign manager. And he managed Harding's campaign for president. And Harding's campaign was kind of famous for being the last of the truly porch front campaigns, that instead of traveling around the country, Harding would sit out on his front porch here, or stand or talk on his front porch here in Marion, Ohio, and people would come to him, interest groups, politicians from around the country. This next photograph is of Jess Smith sitting on the grounds of Harding's property in Marion with Harding's wife. This is Mrs. Harding, who he fondly called the Duchess. So Jess Smith was an intimate of the president as well as of the Attorney General. Well, the first time Remus met Jess Smith, he gave him 10 $1,000 bills. That was the first 10,000 of which Remus later testified in front of a congressional committee was eventually $250,000 that he had paid to Jess Smith in bribes. And in return, Jess Smith promised that the Justice Department would never bother Remus or his men, and that if anything happened, he assured him none of them would see the inside of a jail cell. So Remus thought he was safe. He was protected at the highest level. This is the Rathskeller. This is the downstairs bar at the Seelbach Hotel in Louisville. Now here we're getting into a point where we're not exactly sure what happened. What we do know is that Remus eventually owned 2 different distilleries in Louisville, and that he visited Louisville frequently, and there were stories written about him in the Louisville newspaper. Now, what some people believe did happen at some point during these years is that at the bar here, he may have met F. Scott Fitzgerald. And there's some speculation that Remus was one of the people who inspired the Great Gatsby. Again, we can't nail down proof. We do know that Fitzgerald frequently went to Louisville because his wife Daisy's parents were in Louisville. He was also stationed there toward the end of World War I. Now, one thing that Remus did not really plan for was this woman, Mabel Walker Willebrandt. She was an assistant attorney general, and she was actually had the highest position in an administration of any woman to that point. She was a single woman from California, very good lawyer, and she, unlike her boss, was dedicated to enforcing prohibition. She knew about Remus, but was not able to, so to speak, get at him for a while. But she kind of never let him out of her sights. In fact, when she wrote a book about her experiences, she referred to what Remus was exploiting as the big leak. The fact that there are all these distilleries, all these millions of gallons of alcohol that were just kind of sitting there in warehouses that Remus was kind of linking back up with the public. Well, eventually, there was another person that Remus could not pay off, and that was a prohibition officer in Indiana, a guy named Burt Morgan. Burt Morgan had a little bit of luck. There was a small-time bootlegger named Nathan Goldman who got caught in Indianapolis. And like a true bootlegger, he would not name his source. So he let him stew in the Marion County jail for a while, and then brought him back in to interview him after a month there and said, where'd you get your alcohol? And he said, well, okay, it was a farm west of Cincinnati called Johnny's Place. That's all I know, Johnny's Place. Well, Johnny Garham was one of Remus's lieutenants, and he was the guy who actually held the deed to the Death Valley farm. And Goldman also admitted that he had been a little short of cash, And so along with the cash, he had paid for the alcohol with a check, a $250 check. So that provided a paper trail. Burt Morgan got together with a guy named Simon, who is a prohibition officer in Chicago, and he had caught a couple rum runners who again said that their source was some farm west of Cincinnati. So these two guys went to Cincinnati on the weekend, and since they were from Indiana and Illinois, they did not have the power to serve a warrant in Ohio. So they brought the Prohibition Commissioner for Cincinnati to a hotel, actually the Sinton Hotel, ironically, and basically kept him so he couldn't get to a phone because they figured he'd probably been one of the people paid off by Remus. So they said, you know, you're going to be the person who's going to write out the warrant. We're going to raid the Death Valley farm this afternoon. Now, Remus had heard some rumor that there were some strange prohibition agents in town, and he had told people to clean things up at the farm and to be extra vigilant. Well, nobody paid any attention to those orders. So when they came up to raid the farm, nobody at the guardhouse shack challenged them. They just figured they were customers, you know, customers coming to get some alcohol. And so when they opened the door of the farmhouse, the guys were playing poker, and there was a bottle of Squibb's whiskey on the table. Squibb's was a large distillery recently bought by Remus in Indiana. Ostensibly, the owner was his brother-in-law, Harry Brown. Well, to make a long story short, in the middle of the raid, George Connors and Johnny Garum pulled up in Connors' Marmon. And one of the prohibition agents pretended like he was drunk and came up to Connors, you know, and grabbed him by the lapels and said, "We'd like to buy some alcohol." And Connors thought something was weird. You know, he says, you come to the wrong place. There's no alcohol here, you know, and if you don't get your hands off me, I'll crack you in the chin. And he says, "Come on, Johnny, let's go." He says, "That was a mistake." And the other guy says, "Oh, Johnny, are you Johnny Garum? Oh, we've got a warrant for your premises here." So Connors drove back to town and told Remus what was going on. Remus was irate. So he grabbed an automatic weapon and said he was going to stage and raid the raiders, you know, and Imogene came out of the house screaming and bawling and whatnot, begging him not to go. And so Remus decided not to do that. And Connors' later comment was, "Well, that's what happens when you let a skirt get caught up in your business." So to make a long story short, Remus and his lieutenants were arrested. This was in early 1922. And the trial was held in Cincinnati. This was a federal trial. The judge was an experienced guy, this guy here named Arthur Weld. And even though Remus's lawyers, high-priced lawyers came all sorts of objections and ways to have the case dismissed and all that, he kind of waved everything aside. And the key testimony was from a woman named Hubbard that the newspapers, of course, dubbed Mother Hubbard. Well, Mary Hubbard lived in the house that I showed you that kind of overlooked the farm. And her husband had done a lot of handiwork at Death Valley Farm and knew what was going on, and mysteriously had died of poisoning 2 weeks before the trial. So Mary Hubbard testified, and basically, you know, all her evidence was corroborated, although some people did save their butts. One of the things that they got was a huge book of Remus's clients. But strangely, once they got to trial, several pages were missing. So supposedly, several prominent local politicians and business people were on those pages. So even though Remus was convicted, along with his lieutenants in that, it was months and months before they were ever sent to prison. And meanwhile, Remus, you know, had all sorts of appeals and whatnot, tried to get his case heard. And eventually, rumors started to swirl around the whole Harding administration. Attorney General Dougherty himself kind of came under suspicion. But all this time, Remus kept giving money to Jess Smith. In fact, one time he said that he went to the train station in Indianapolis to give Smith his regular payment. And Smith happened to be talking to Harry Dougherty at the time and had to leave that conversation to come over to get the bribe from Remus. And you know, Remus asserted, "I'm sure, you know, the Attorney General knew knew what was going on, or he was probably the person that was actually receiving the bribe. So eventually, the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, but Remus lost. And the last thing he did was he got Senator Reed from Missouri to try to ask the new president, Coolidge, to let him off, but no. So Remus went to prison. Remus and 8 of his lieutenants went to the Atlanta Federal Prison, and that's the lovely place depicted there. I should mention that during the appeals, eventually, I guess Jeff Smith had made too many promises that he couldn't keep, and so he shot himself in the head. And he did this, remember, he's sharing an apartment with the Attorney General, and the case was kind of hushed up very quickly. They quickly reached a verdict of suicide, and there never was any autopsy or investigation, and a lot of people kind of wonder if maybe the Attorney General was involved. But a few months after Harding died of natural causes, Attorney General Dougherty resigned under kind of a cloud of suspicion, although he later wrote a book claiming he knew nothing about any payoffs from bootleggers. Throughout this whole thing, Remus said that Imogene, his wife, knew about everything. She was in on all of his plans. The warden, another guy from Ohio, I have to say, a lot of crooks in the Harding administration. A guy named A.E. Sartain was the warden of the federal prison, and he himself was kind of crooked. And so Remus and other well-heeled prisoners often dined with the warden, in a very sumptuous way. And eventually, Mabel Walker Willebrand had this guy, Franklin Dodge, who was an agent of the Bureau of Investigation, which would later become known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so the earlier version of the FBI. And Franklin Dodge kind of went undercover and exposed the abuses of Sartain, and he went to prison. Well, big mistake Remus had. Remus didn't enjoy being in prison, and so he was looking at some way to get out. I should have told you what his sentence was. This is going to sound very piddly, and it was at the time, but it was the toughest sentence on the book for somebody who'd been caught bootlegging. He got a $1,000 fine and 2 years in federal prison. That was it. And then they really threw the book at him. He also got an extra year in prison from the state of Ohio for running a public nuisance, the Death Valley Farm. So, but even 3 years in prison was too long for Remus. But he still owned all these distilleries and warehouses in 5 different states. And so he still operated them through Imogene. But he also tried to have Imogene's, figure out, what way, maybe he cooperated with Franklin Dodge in the little scam to catch the warden. And so he thought, well, maybe Dodge could help him get out of prison early, He said, I'll do anything, I'll testify. In fact, he did testify in Congress against Dougherty. I'll cooperate with any federal investigation, I just want to get out of prison. Things didn't work out well. To make a long story short, Imogene and Franklin Dodge began an affair. And not only did they begin an affair, they decided that the smart thing to do was to start liquidating Remus's empire. So one by one, they started selling off his distilleries and his warehouses full of alcohol. And of course, eventually, rumor of this did get to Remus, and he was none too pleased, to say the least. Okay, this is a warehouse in St. Louis that belonged to the Jack Daniels Company. Before Remus had gone to prison, he and several other bootleggers had combined in a conspiracy to siphon, gradually take the alcohol out of the barrels in this warehouse and basically replace it with sugar water. And here's the lovely group of co-conspirators here. There was eventually a trial in the fall of 1926 about the Jack Daniels siphoning, and these were some of Remus's co-defendants. Well, Remus, wanting to get out of prison, volunteered to testify against his co-defendants. Now, they thought they might have had trouble having a truly neutral jury in St. Louis, so the trial was moved to Indianapolis. Now, this is a nice awkward photograph here. Imogene and Remus. Now, since they were married, they could not testify against each other in this trial. So they were photographed here, and Remus was trying to patch things up with Imogene at this point, already hearing rumors of what was going on with her and Franklin Dodge. But also, one of the reasons why I can tell you all this stuff is that during this trial, this journalist here, Paul Y. Anderson, who wrote for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, did a series where he interviewed Remus, Connors, several other people, and they were very talkative about how the Remus operation worked and what was going on in Cincinnati. Now, Paul Y. Anderson would eventually, a couple years later, win the Pulitzer Prize for a series he did on the Teapot Dome scandal, although sadly he committed suicide in the early 1930s. But he did a quite extensive series of articles during this trial about the Remus operation and how it had worked in Cincinnati. Shortly after the trial ended, this guy comes into the picture, Fiorello LaGuardia. He was not yet mayor of New York. He was at this time in the House of Representatives. He was a Republican congressman, and he was somebody who was thought prohibition was a bad idea. And here he's famously showing how you could go to almost any store and buy certain things and make real beer out of fake beer, saying how easy it was to do. And his big thing was he was against prohibition because he thought it was corrupting law enforcement. And so somehow the Remus story got to him. And basically, the way we know what different distilleries Remus owned at one point was because LaGuardia entered this information into the congressional record. He pointed to Franklin Dodge, who at this point was still with the Bureau of Investigation, and Imogene selling off these assets of Remus as an example of law enforcement being corrupted by prohibition. Well, after serving 2 years in Atlanta, Remus bounced around to different county jails in Ohio, serving the one-year nuisance thing. In fact, he was briefly in the Montgomery County Jail. He spent more time in Miami. He finished things up down in Portsmouth, Ohio, was the last where he spent his time. And then here's a photograph of him not looking exactly happy on his return to Cincinnati. So when he came back to his mansion, he found the place was all locked. He had to break in through a window. He found that the place was mostly emptied. A lot of the furniture was gone. The rest was covered in sheets. And of course, Imogene was not there. She was off somewhere with Franklin Dodge. And so he started proceedings to divorce his wife and to try to bring back, see if he could get control of his empire once again. Also, I should mention that Dodge and Imogene also looked into possibly having Remus deported, as far as his citizenship status. Well, on the morning of October 6th of 1927 was supposed to be the opening day of their divorce proceedings in downtown Cincinnati. Well, Remus, Imogene and her daughter Ruth were staying at the Alms Hotel, and Remus had his driver park outside the Alms Hotel waiting for his wife to exit. So his wife and their adopted daughter Ruth came out and got into a cab, and Remus told his driver to follow the cab. And eventually, it eventually became a chase. Remus's driver followed the cab into Eden Park, which is the closest way from the Alms Hotel to downtown Cincinnati. When they got near the gazebo in Eden Park, Remus's car was able to cut off the cab. And at this point, Remus got out of the car, went over to the cab, opened the door, grabbed Imogene by the wrist, yanked her out of the car, and pulled a pistol out of his suit coat pocket. And at this point, she's screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, you know I love you, don't do it, don't do it." And he shoved the pistol against her abdomen, fired one shot. And she fell to the ground. And by the way, this is the testimony of Imogene's daughter, Ruth, who was there at the time. She got out, grabbed, Remus by the lapel, says, "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing." And he just says, "She can't get away with that." And in the confusion, both drivers left the scene. Remus's driver left the scene. The cabbie left the scene. Okay, Imogene is bleeding and on the ground, but still conscious. So Ruth is able to flag down a passing motorist, get her mom into the back of the car. She kind of collapses onto the back floor, and says, "Isn't it?" And her mom said, "Isn't it terrible that George did this?" She's crying hysterically. They drive off to the hospital. And Remus eventually flags down a car, a passing motorist. At some point, he gets rid of the murder weapon. We don't know exactly where, somewhere in Eden Park. And he says, "Take me to the station." And Remus is thinking train station, but instead he takes him to a downtown station, which is more of a transfer station for the trolleys and buses. And at some point, Remus changes his mind and says, "I've done nothing wrong. I have a clear conscience." So he walks over to a nearby police station and turns himself in. Says, "Gentlemen, I've just shot my wife." To make a long story short, Imogene dies at the hospital, a couple hours after she gets there. And now this is like national news. And Remus starts giving a kind of an impromptu press conference right there in downtown jail and says, "I've done a public service. It's a justified homicide. I'll sleep better tonight than I have in a couple years." Now, when he was a lawyer in Illinois, there was such a thing as justified homicide, but not in Ohio in 1927. And so eventually, Remus decides to hire a local lawyer. And, well, first he says, "I'm going to defend myself. I'm a lawyer. I'm capable of doing it." He liked to talk often in the third person. Remus is going to play a lone hand, But he decides better, and he hires a local lawyer named Charles Elston. Elston kind of had a background like Remus in the sense that he didn't have a lot of money, went to night school, became a lawyer. He actually worked in the prosecutor's office for a while in Cincinnati, but now he was a defense lawyer. And the guy who was the county prosecutor, had just been elected less than a year ago, is this guy, Charles Taft, the son of William Howard Taft. Now, people are more familiar with Taft's older son, Robert, who became the senator from Ohio. But when Charles was the younger boy, he was actually the guy that everybody thought would be another president. He was handsome, personable, kind of unlike his older brother, who was always kind of dour. He was a Yale graduate and went to Yale Law School. He went off and served in the Army during World War I. And now he was the newly elected county prosecutor of Hamilton County in Cincinnati. But he'd only done 2 murder cases. He had won one and he had lost one. And the one he had lost to Charles Elston, the guy Remus had hired as co-counsel. So there was a lot of publicity around the trial, to say the least. This is Remus photographed looking for the murder weapon. He led people and the marshals around, Eden Park, looking for the murder weapon unsuccessfully. And there were all kinds of photographs in the newspapers. This is Remus studying law books, brushing up on the Ohio law so he can defend himself. Trials went very fast in those days. I mean, the murder happened on October 6th, and they went to trial in early December. And there were preliminary hearings before that. The most important hearing, though, Taft was kind of in a hurry to get this high publicity trial over with. And so one of the mistakes that was made is, Elston basically convinced Remus that your only shot is temporary insanity. There is no justified murder in Ohio, So the only way you can get off is temporary insanity. And Remus, reluctantly agreed to that. And he even kind of baited reporters saying, I'm perfectly sane, Anybody who suggests otherwise would be insane. And then he would say, but of course, it's always insane people who think other people are insane. He was always kind of playing games with the reporters. Anyway, going up to the trial, what he and Elston did very successfully is to try to make Franklin, Dodge, and Imogene the real villains. In fact, they went around to different cities in the Midwest. Dodge was from Lansing, Michigan, and yes, he was related to the Dodge car family. And they went to all different cities where they had opened safety deposit boxes. And they drilled into the safety deposit boxes looking for Remus's millions. Where did they stash the money from selling off Remus's assets? And of course, they never found much of anything. But as they went from city to city, the press followed them, and this became a big focus of the story. Remus's mom, tearful mom, came to Cincinnati to be by his side and testify, what a good boy he was. And even Remus's daughter from his first marriage, Romola Remus, came and stood by him, visited him every day in the cell and sat next to him on the trial. She had actually become an entertainer, kind of a singer in Chicago. Now, William Howard Taft, the only ex-president who ever joined the Supreme Court, he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And there's an interesting letter of him to his son Charles, where he didn't say that this was going to be a simple open and shut case. He said they'll probably try the case in the press, and there might be some tricky problems with evidence. So like I said, there's all kinds of hype leading up to the trial. And here's a couple photographs of Remus. Again, like I said, he was a health nut. Here he is working out on the roof of the Hamilton County Jail in downtown Cincinnati, because he was going to hit the books, but he also had to stay in physical shape for the trial. This building, which is still in Cincinnati, was the courthouse where the trial was held. And here are the jurors. 10 men, 2 women, and an alternate that would serve as jurors in the trial. Now, the judge was a guy named Charles Shook, and he had only been a judge for 2 years, so he didn't have a lot of experience. And the one mistake he made was, well, maybe not the only mistake he made, but one of the big mistakes they made was they decided, rather than deciding if Remus was sane or not before the trial, they would combine it with the trial. So strangely, behind the judge's bench, they had another bench set up where they had 3 psychologists, which in those days they called alienists, who were going to observe Remus during the trial and try to judge whether or not he was sane. Because he was not just going to be the accused, but he was also going to be one of the 2 defense lawyers. And this is a photograph taken during the trial. Of course, Remus on the left, his daughter from his first marriage, Romola, in the middle. The guy on the right is Charles Elston, who was his co-counsel. Now, I could go through the whole trial, which took a couple weeks, but I won't. But to make a long story short, it was basically a good lawyer, bad lawyer sort of thing. Obviously, the most effective lawyer in the trial was Charles Elston. And his focus kept on being on the actions of Imogene and Dodge, even presenting that perhaps at one time they had hired a hitman to bump off George Remus. They talked about trying to possibly get him deported, as well as what they did with financially. And Remus was a total loose cannon during the trial. In fact, at some point when they were talking about the plans to possibly kill him, he lost it and started crying. On another point, he almost got into a fist fight with one of Taft's assistant lawyers. They had to calm things down and have a recess. And of course, at the closing remarks, both Remus and Elston had closing remarks. And there's a photograph of Remus making his closing remarks. So when the trial went to the jury, it was within a week of Christmas. It was about the 18th or 19th of December. They only deliberated for slightly over a half hour. And it was actually would have been shorter than that, but they pretended they had to go longer so at least they'd get lunch. One of them later admitted. And they came back. The judge asked what the verdict was, and the verdict was not guilty by reason of insanity. And the courtroom erupted, and Remus yelled out, "I asked for American justice, and you gave it to me." And here's Remus shaking hands with the younger of the two female jury members and the jury foreman. So naturally, this was a huge embarrassment to Charles Taft, losing this trial, a huge embarrassment really to Cincinnati at the time, and people were very upset about it. And of course, the alienists, before the verdict went to the jury, they said, well, he's sane, he's perfectly sane. Well, Taft pulled out all stops, and he convinced two of the alienists to change their minds and to decide a few days afterwards that Remus, after all, was insane. And that way, he wouldn't be able to just go free. So he went to up to Lima to a state penitentiary for the insane. But he only spent about 6 months there. During the time there, he was credited with rescuing one of the guards who was attacked by one of the inmates, and Remus went and jumped on the guy's back and tackled the guy who was tackling one of the guards. And to make a long story short, Elston basically got him out of there after about 6 months. So Remus literally got away with murder, but the rest of his life was not a great success. Mabel Walker Willebrandt, she was the one who pursued prohibitionists in a very dedicated manner. And when Coolidge announced he was not running for re-election, she was still an assistant attorney general. She went out and campaigned like crazy for Herbert Hoover. She went all over the country campaigning for Hoover, thinking he gets elected president, I'll be the first woman attorney general. No, she was passed over. And so she left government at that point, and later on became a very highly paid lawyer in, of all places, Hollywood. A lot of people think that the Remus trial ruined the political career of Charles Taft. He only served one term as county prosecutor in Cincinnati, so he lost his bid for re-election, although he did clean up a lot of the corruption. I think at one point there were something like 51 police officers or other law enforcement people that later admitted that they had taken bribes from Remus and other bootleggers. Now, he did get on the cover of Time magazine for 1 week in 1936 as part of the shadow cabinet of that famous president, Alf Landon. Alf Landon, of course, lost the 1936 election in a landslide to FDR. But had Alf Landon won, Charles Taft might have been his attorney general. He ran unsuccessfully for governor of Ohio a couple times, and then he did serve as mayor of Cincinnati for a while in the 1950s. Now, as far as Remus himself, the rest of his life was really, the punishment for him was to live the rest of his life in relative obscurity. He tried to piece together bits of his empire, which wasn't successful. He was pursued by all kinds of different lawsuits, tax penalties and whatnot. He eventually had to sell his mansion in the 1930s, bulldozed it, sold the property eventually. And he did manage to get married another time. A secretary named Blanche Watson married him, who became his third wife for the remainder of his life. And he kind of lived in a small, very modest home in Covington, Kentucky. Now, at one point during the proceedings, when Elston had got the judge to basically, he pointed out an inconsistency as far as that you could be ruled insane and unable to stand trial with a simple majority, whereas it took a unanimous decision to convict you of murder. And that was one of the reasons why the judge decided to do the insanity hearing along with the trial, which was a big mistake. And when that maneuver happened, Remus said that was a brilliant maneuver. You'll get a diamond stick pen for that. He said that to his co-counsel, Elston. Well, Elston himself became very successful. He actually served 5 terms as a congressman from Cincinnati. So being the winning lawyer in the Remus trial didn't hurt his reputation at all. So he basically served from like the late 30s through the early 1950s. Well, at one point when he was, during this time when he was in Congress, When Remus eventually died in early 1952, they came to him and said, any kind of interesting stories, things we haven't heard. And he said, well, he says, one thing that was kind of strange was many years after the trial, he was at his office in Cincinnati. And they said, well, Mr. Remus is here to see you. And he thought, Remus? I haven't seen Remus in 15, 16 years. So Remus came into the room. Normally, Remus was dressed impeccably in tailored suits and whatnot. He came in looking a little bit shabby, but always dramatic. So he came in, pulled something out of his pocket, plopped it down on the desk in front of Elston, opened it up, and said, Remus never forgets, and walked out of the room. And it was a diamond stick pin that he had gotten years and years later. So Remus was buried along with his third wife, Blanche, at a little small cemetery in Falmouth, Kentucky. And as kind of a final editorial comment, at some point after Remus was buried, someone came along and knocked the wings off the angels on his tomb. But Remus has made a little bit of a comeback. Yes, a few years ago, they started making bourbon in his name. And so finally, someone's decided to, for about 40, 50 years, Cincinnati was kind of embarrassed about the story of Remus, and now they're a little bit more proud of it. So about 6 years ago, they started making actually a line of whiskeys now. First, it was just the bourbon. They have a couple different ones now. So they're capitalizing on his name. One ironic thing about it is this alcohol is actually made at the Indiana distillery that used to be Squibb's Distillery, which at one time was actually owned by Remus under the name of his brother-in-law, Harry Brown. And that's the end of our story.